The morning I found out, there were still save-the-date magnets on my refrigerator. 14 of them. I had ordered a box of 50 from a custom print shop on Etsy. Pale ivory cardstock, our names in navy serif font, Daniel and Naomi, June 14th, and I'd kept the extras because I liked seeing them. I liked walking into my kitchen at 6:47 in the morning, still half asleep in my socks, and seeing proof that something beautiful was coming. That morning I walked into that same kitchen, looked at those same magnets and understood, with the specific airless clarity that only complete betrayal delivers, that June 14th was never going to happen. Not the way I'd planned it. Not with him. Daniel had called me the night before, which should have told me something. He never called. He was a texter, short, efficient, no punctuation. A phone call after 10 p.m. from Daniel meant something had shifted. I remember I was folding laundry when my phone lit up. His name on the screen. I actually smiled before I answered. The conversation lasted 11 minutes. I know because I checked my call log 4 days later, when I was trying to reconstruct the timeline of my own life falling apart. 11 minutes to end a 3-year relationship, a shared lease, a wedding deposit of $4,200 already paid to a venue in Lincoln Park, and every version of the future I had quietly been building in my head since I was 23 years old. He didn't yell. He wasn't cruel in any obvious way. That almost made it worse. He spoke in the careful, rehearsed tone of someone who had practiced the conversation enough times that the guilt had already been processed and filed away. He said the words, "I think we want different things and I haven't been fully present and I need you to know this isn't about you." It was absolutely about me. And it was absolutely about Mia. He didn't say her name that night. He didn't have to. There are things you know before you know them. Sensations that arrive in your chest before your brain has finished forming the sentence. I knew the shape of what had happened before he finished speaking. I just sat down on my kitchen floor, back against the cabinet under the sink, laundry half folded on the couch behind me, and I let him finish. When he hung up, I stayed on that floor for a long time. The magnets were still on the refrigerator. Daniel and Naomi, June 14th. The print shop had done a beautiful job. Peeled them off one by one. I didn't throw them away that night. I just put them in a drawer. I think I wasn't ready to make the decision permanent. By morning I would have no choice. My name is Naomi Reeves. At the time this story begins, I was 26 years old, living in a 1-bedroom apartment in Wicker Park, Chicago, working as a junior associate at a mid-sized interior design firm called Callaway & Blaine. I made $52,000 a year. I drove a 2014 Honda Civic with a cracked left side mirror that I kept meaning to fix. I had $6,300 in my savings account and approximately $3,800 in a joint account Daniel and I had opened to manage wedding expenses. I was, by most external measures, an ordinary young woman in the early chapters of an ordinary life. I want you to understand that clearly because the story I'm about to tell you depends on you seeing me the way I actually was. Not some exceptional person who was always going to triumph, but a genuinely average 26-year-old who was blindsided, broken, and starting from almost nothing. I had met Daniel Carver at the University of Illinois Chicago during our junior year. He was studying business administration. I was studying art history, which everyone including my mother treated as a decorative choice rather than an academic one. We met at a mutual friend's apartment during what I can only describe as the kind of chaotic Thursday night that only exists when you're 21 and the rent is still someone else's problem. He was funny. He was attentive in the early months, which I confused for depth. He had a very specific way of making you feel like the only person in a crowded room. A skill I would later understand, that is less about love and more about a certain category of personality. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. The proposal happened on a Saturday morning in November, at the kitchen table, over coffee. No restaurant, no crowd, no Instagram moment. Just a small velvet box slid across the table while we were both still in pajamas. Cried. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I was so certain. Mia Holloway had been my best friend since sophomore year of college. We had met in a 200-level literature seminar, bonded over our mutual contempt for a particular professor's grading system, and been inseparable from that point forward. She was one of my bridesmaids. She had been in my apartment the week before everything fell apart, sitting at that exact kitchen table, looking at venue photos on my laptop, eating takeout pad thai from the place on Milwaukee Avenue that we had ordered from approximately 400 times since college. That is the part that still catches me sometimes, even now. Not Daniel. Mia. Because Daniel was someone I loved. But Mia was someone I trusted in the way you only trust a handful of people across an entire lifetime. The kind of trust that doesn't require maintenance because it seems so structurally sound that it never occurs to you to check the foundation. She had been with him for 5 months before I found out. 5 months of phone calls with me about wedding centerpieces. 5 months of double-cheek kisses hello. 5 months of sitting in my kitchen. The morning after Daniel's phone call, Mia sent me a text. It arrived at 8:14 a.m. I still know the exact wording because I screenshotted it before I deleted her number, and I found the screenshot years later in a folder on an old phone. It said, "I'm so sorry, Naomi. I hope someday you can understand." I stared at that message for a long time. I didn't respond. I didn't know what to say to someone who had just confirmed in 10 words that they had been living a secret inside your life for nearly half a year. What I did instead was sit down, open my laptop, and look up the application requirements for Northwestern's MBA program. That decision, made at 8:22 a.m. on a Tuesday in April, changed everything that came after. Here is something no one tells you about betrayal by a best friend. It doesn't arrive as a single event. It arrives, in retrospect, as a pattern. A series of moments you lived through in real time without understanding their shape, that only snap into terrible clarity once the truth is sitting in front of you. I have gone back through the months before April more times than I should probably admit. Not obsessively, not anymore, but with the cool, analytical attention I eventually learned to apply to most things after graduate school. And what I found when I looked honestly was that the signs were there. Not obvious, not cinematic, but there. The first one I remember clearly happened in January, about 4 months before the end. The 3 of us had gone to dinner, one of those group dinners that couples and close friends fall into routinely, the kind where you split an appetizer and someone orders a bottle of wine and nobody talks about anything that actually matters. Daniel and Mia had gotten into a conversation about a documentary series on Netflix, some crime thing, that they had apparently both been watching independently. I remember thinking it was funny that they had the same taste. I remember thinking it was sweet, actually, that my fiancé and my best friend had things in common. I remember Mia glancing at Daniel across the table, and then down at her plate in a movement so brief and so controlled that I would have missed it if I hadn't happened to be looking directly at her in that exact second. I filed it away without a category. I didn't know what shelf to put it on. The second moment was in February. I had asked Mia to come with me to a bridal appointment, a second fitting at a boutique on Oak Street that required a companion to properly evaluate the back of the dress. She cancelled 2 hours before. Said she had a work thing. I went alone, stood in front of a 3-panel mirror in a dress I had spent 4 months choosing, and texted her a photo from the dressing room. She responded 40 minutes later with 3 heart emojis. At the time I thought she was just busy. Now I understand she was likely with Daniel that afternoon. I have never confirmed this. I have never needed to. The third moment was the one that should have stopped me cold, and didn't. 6 weeks before the end, I was at Mia's apartment, a bright, cluttered 1-bedroom in Logan Square she had lived in since graduation. I was using her bathroom, and her phone, which was charging on the bathroom counter, lit up with a notification. I wasn't snooping. I wasn't suspicious. I just happened to be standing there when the screen activated. It was a text preview. From a contact listed only as D. I saw 4 words before the screen went dark. Thinking about you today. I stood in that bathroom for a moment. My reflection looked back at me in the mirror above the sink. I ran the cold water. I washed my hands. I told myself it was nothing. Coworker. Relative. An old friend with a name that started with D. I told myself the story that was easier to live with. That is the cruelest mechanics of this kind of betrayal. It doesn't overcome your judgment all at once. It wins by increments. It offers you the comfortable interpretation each time, and you take it because you are not a suspicious person by nature, and because the alternative requires dismantling things you are not prepared to dismantle. When I finally understood the full picture, after Daniel's call and Mia's text, I didn't feel stupid. I want to be clear about that. I felt something more specific than stupid. I felt like someone who had been deliberately handed the wrong map and then blamed for getting lost. They had not been careless. They had been careful. Carefully compartmentalized. Carefully managed. The dinners. The wedding planning sessions. The bridesmaid conversations. The 3 heart emojis from a woman who was sleeping with my fiancé. All of it deliberate. All of it chosen. That is what moved the story forward for me. Not the grief, though the grief was enormous. It was the understanding that this was not a mistake that happened to me. It was a decision that was made about me. And if they were capable of making that decision, of choosing to disrespect me that precisely and that consistently, then they had never seen me clearly. They had never understood who they were actually dealing with. 7 years later, in a hotel ballroom in Chicago, they were about to find out. The actual ending happened on a Wednesday afternoon in April, 4 days after Daniel's phone call. I had not called him back. I had not responded to Mia's text. I had spent those 4 days in a specific kind of suspended silence, going to work, coming home, eating whatever required the least preparation, sleeping badly and waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for exactly. Clarification, maybe. Or an apology that arrived with enough weight to mean something. Or maybe I was just waiting because I wasn't ready to make the next move and I needed them to make theirs first. They made it together. It was 2:17 in the afternoon on a Wednesday. I was working from home that day, sitting at my desk in the corner of my bedroom with a site plan open on my screen, when I heard a knock at my apartment door. Not a buzz from the lobby, which meant someone in the building had let them in, or the street door hadn't latched properly again, which happened constantly in that building. Just a knock. 3 times. Unhurried, I opened the door and they were both standing there. Daniel had his hands in his jacket pockets. Mia was standing slightly behind his left shoulder, which told me everything about the conversation they had rehearsed on the way over. He was the one who was going to speak. She was there for support, his support, not mine. I remember the specific quality of the light in that hallway. It was one of those flat, gray Chicago afternoons in early April where the sun exists somewhere behind the clouds but contributes nothing. The hallway fluorescent was flickering slightly, the way it had been for 6 weeks despite 3 maintenance requests. Daniel looked tired. Mia was not making eye contact. I didn't invite them in. I stood in the doorway. Daniel spoke first. He said, "Naomi, we need you to hear this from us directly. Mia and I have feelings for each other. This isn't something either of us planned." I remember registering the word "we" at the beginning of that sentence and understanding, cleanly and completely, that the unit had already been formed. There was no longer a Daniel and Naomi. There was now a Daniel and Mia, arriving at my door as a finished fact. I said very quietly, "How long?" It wasn't a question. It was a request for a number. He paused. Mia shifted her weight slightly. Then he said, "A few months." 5, I said. 'Cause I had done the math. Because the D on Mia's phone, the glance at dinner in January, the cancelled fitting in February. I had already assembled the timeline in the 4 days I'd spent waiting for this conversation. Neither of them corrected me. Then Mia spoke. She looked up for the first time and she said, "I know this hurts. But I hope you know that you are so strong, Naomi. You are going to be completely fine." I want to be careful here about how I describe what that sentence did to me, because I don't want to be theatrical about it. I want to be precise. What Mia's words did, the specific injury of them, was reframe my pain as a compliment to my resilience before I had even been given permission to feel the pain. She was not consoling me. She was dismissing me efficiently, using the language of support as a closing mechanism. "You're so strong" is what people say when they want to stop feeling responsible for how badly they've hurt you. I looked at her for a moment. Then I looked at Daniel. Then I said very evenly, "You should go." And they did. They turned and walked down that flickering hallway together, and I stood in my doorway and watched them reach the stairwell, and the door swung shut behind them, and the hallway went quiet. Closed my apartment door. I walked to my kitchen. I stood at the counter for a long time looking at the spot on the refrigerator where the save-the-date magnets used to be. I had peeled them off 4 days earlier and put them in a drawer. I still hadn't thrown them away. Opened the drawer. I looked at them for a moment. Daniel and Naomi, June 14th, still clean, still perfectly printed. 14 ivory rectangles that had believed in something I no longer had access to. I put them in the recycling bin. Then I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and submitted my application to Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. That was the last decision I ever made from that kitchen floor. Every decision after that I made standing up. What they didn't know was that the version of me standing in that doorway was the last version of me they would ever have the advantage over. They didn't know that because they weren't watching. People who leave rarely watch. They move forward into their new thing and they carry a specific, convenient story about the person they left. A story that keeps that person small and manageable and frozen at the moment of departure, because a frozen person is easier to feel okay about than a growing one. In Daniel and Mia's version of the story, I was the girl on the kitchen floor. That was the last frame they had of me. For 7 years that was the image they got to keep. They were not aware of what was happening in the frames after. Northwestern's Kellogg MBA program accepted me 8 weeks after I submitted the application. I remember reading the acceptance email 3 times before it felt real. I had applied on grief and momentum and a 3.7 undergraduate GPA and what I can only describe as the specific clarity of a person who has nothing left to protect and therefore nothing left to lose. I deferred my start date by 1 semester to save money, picked up freelance design consulting work on the side, and moved from Wicker Park to a smaller apartment in Evanston to cut rent by $340 a month. The next 2 years were the quietest, most concentrated period of my life. I was not on social media in any meaningful way. I was not dating. I was not performing recovery for anyone's benefit. I was simply working, coursework, consulting projects, a part-time position at a boutique architecture firm in Evanston that paid $28 an hour and taught me more about client management than any classroom. I graduated from Kellogg with a 3.91 GPA and 2 consulting clients who had already indicated they wanted to follow me wherever I went next. I moved to New York City in the August after graduation with $14,200 in savings, a laptop, and a registered LLC called Reeves & Company. Interiors that I had filed in Delaware 3 months before I left Chicago because the filing fees were lower and the legal structure was cleaner. I had done the research. I had talked to an attorney. I was not improvising anymore. By year 3 in New York, Reeves & Company was generating $380,000 in annual revenue. By year 5, we had crossed $900,000. By the time the reunion invitation arrived in my inbox, a Google form with an Eventbrite link, sent by someone on the UIC alumni committee I barely remembered. I was 33 years old, running a firm with 4 full-time employees and a client roster that included 2 boutique hotels and a restaurant group with locations in Manhattan and Brooklyn. The reunion invitation sat in my inbox for 11 days before I opened it. But here is the part of the story that does not get told in the highlights version. The part one only discovered because I finally, after 7 years, cleared out the last storage unit I had kept in Chicago. A 5 by 10 climate-controlled space at a facility on Elston Avenue, $74 a month, that I had been paying for on autopilot since the move to New York because it contained boxes I had not been emotionally ready to open, and the third box, underneath a rolled canvas print I had bought at a street market in 2015 and a folder of old lease documents, I found a vendor financing agreement. Dated March of the year we were supposed to get married. Signed by Daniel. With my credit profile attached as supporting documentation. He had used my credit, without my knowledge, without my signature, without any disclosure, to help secure a $22,000 financing arrangement for his family's small event rental business. My credit score at the time had been 748. His, I would later learn, was considerably lower. I sat on the storage unit floor for a long time. Then I took out my phone and called a financial attorney in Chicago whose name I had gotten from a former Kellogg classmate. Her first words, after I described the document, were, "How soon do you need this resolved?" I said, "I'm attending a reunion in 6 weeks. I'd like it handled before then." She said, "That's enough time." That was the moment everything shifted. I want to be precise about something before I describe what happened next, because I think precision matters here and I think it reflects something important about who I had become by this point in the story. I did not go to that reunion for revenge. I want you to understand that distinction because it changes the entire texture of what follows. Revenge is reactive. Revenge means the other person still has enough power over you to determine your agenda. What I went to that reunion for was something quieter and more complete than revenge. I went because I had built something real, and I was no longer willing to stay invisible to protect other people's comfort. The 6 weeks between the storage unit and the reunion were methodical. My attorney, her name was Claire, she had been practicing financial law in Chicago for 14 years, reviewed the vendor financing agreement in full. The use of my credit profile without documented consent was, in her assessment, actionable. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but cleanly, legally actionable. We sent a formal demand letter to Daniel's family business address. A single document, professionally drafted, requesting either a signed acknowledgement of the unauthorized use and a negotiated resolution, or we would proceed to file with the appropriate credit reporting and regulatory bodies. The response came back in 9 days. Through his own attorney, which told me the letter had landed with appropriate seriousness, Daniel agreed to a negotiated resolution. The terms were straightforward. A formal written acknowledgement of the unauthorized credit use. A payment of $4,800 in documented damages, calculated against the credit impact and the legal fees I had incurred. And a signed release confirming no further claims from either party. He paid by bank transfer on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the reunion. I did not gloat. I did not tell anyone. I simply forwarded the confirmation to Claire, thanked her for her work, and closed that chapter of the paperwork with the same clean efficiency I had learned to bring to everything in my professional life. Then I turned my attention to what I was going to wear. This may sound like a trivial detail in a story about legal documents and financial leverage, but I want to tell you that the dress I chose for that reunion was not a trivial decision. It was a considered one. I spent a Saturday afternoon in my apartment in the Flatiron District. My apartment that I owned that I had closed on 14 months earlier at $1.1 million, going through my wardrobe with the same intentionality I bring to a client's space. I chose a midnight blue midi dress, structured at the shoulder, clean at the hem, understated. Expensive in the way that only registers to people who know what they're looking at. Low heels because I have never needed height to take up space in a room. I flew into O'Hare on a Friday evening. I took a car to the hotel, a Marriott in the West Loop that the alumni committee had reserved a block of rooms in, checked in, ordered room service, and went to bed at 10:30 p.m. I did not go to the informal mixer the night before the main event. I did not announce my arrival. I had not posted on social media in the weeks leading up to the trip, which meant that whatever Daniel and Mia knew about my life in New York, they knew incompletely. That was intentional. I arrived at the reunion the following evening at 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes after the official start time, which is the exact window where a room has filled enough to notice an entrance without the entrance looking performed. I am telling you this because I want you to understand the level of composure I had developed by 33. Not coldness. Not calculation for its own sake. Just the steady, quiet confidence of a woman who had spent 7 years building something real and no longer felt the need to apologize for arriving fully. I walked in. I got a glass of champagne from the bar near the entrance. I found a former classmate I genuinely liked, a woman named Priya who had become an emergency medicine physician in Cincinnati, and I stood with her and I talked and I laughed and I was entirely, authentically present. I was not scanning the room. I didn't need to scan the room, because 20 minutes after I arrived, I heard a voice behind me that I recognized immediately, even after 7 years, even across the ambient noise of 200 people in a hotel ballroom. Daniel said, "Naomi." And I turned around slowly. Not because I was being dramatic, because I was genuinely mid-sentence with Priya, and I finished the sentence before I turned, because he did not get to interrupt me anymore. Daniel Carver at 34 looked like a man who had made a series of reasonable decisions that had quietly compounded into a life slightly smaller than he had expected. He was well dressed, a navy blazer, dark jeans, the kind of outfit that signals effort without quite achieving distinction. He had the particular look of someone who had peaked at a specific confidence level sometime in his late 20s and had been maintaining it carefully ever since rather than building on it. He was alone when he said my name. Mia was visible about 12 feet behind him, talking to someone near the far side of the bar, wearing a champagne-colored dress that I noticed and then stopped noticing. She had not seen me yet. Daniel, by contrast, could not stop seeing me. I watched his eyes do the thing that eyes do when a person's reality does not match their internal model. A brief, involuntary recalibration. The girl he had last seen standing in a flickering hallway doorway in Wicker Park, in an oversized Northwestern sweatshirt, eyes dry because she had finished crying 4 days earlier. That girl was not what was standing in front of him now. I said, "Daniel, how are you?" Not a question. Greeting. Flat, warm, complete. He said, "Naomi, wow. You look incredible." I smiled the way you smile when someone says something accurate but irrelevant. He said, "Thank you. How's the event business?" I watched that land. His jaw held still, but something moved behind his eyes. A flicker of understanding that I knew about the financing agreement, or that I knew more than I was supposed to, or simply that the question was not random. He said, It's doing okay. We restructured some things last year." "Smart," I said. "Restructuring at the right time makes all the difference." Priya, to her enormous credit, said nothing and sipped her drink. There was a pause. The kind of pause that expands. Daniel filled it the way people fill uncomfortable silences when they are not sure of their footing, with a reach for the familiar, which in his case meant a reach for smallness. He said with the careful casualness of someone who had been preparing this line, "So what are you up to these days?" "Still doing the design thing." Well, that word. Deployed like a thumb on a scale. Still doing the design thing. As though interior design were a hobby I had been puttering around with since college, as though 7 years had produced nothing worth updating, as though the girl on the kitchen floor was the permanent version. I let the word sit in the air for exactly 1 beat. Then I said, "I run a firm in New York. Flatiron District. We closed last year just over $1.2 million in revenue. 2 hotel clients, a restaurant group, and we just signed a residential development project in Tribeca." I said it the way I would say it in any professional context. Evenly, specifically, without performance. So yes, still doing the design thing. The room had not gone quiet. I want to be honest about that. This was not a movie moment where the music stops and everyone turns. The room was still full of its own conversations, its own noise, its own reunions. But the 4 or 5 people within earshot of us, including Priya, including a man I vaguely recognized from an economics class, including a woman whose name I never knew but who was clearly listening, those people heard it. And the space between Daniel and me went very, very still. He said, Wow. That's great, Naomi." And I could hear it in his voice. Not jealousy exactly. Something more complicated and more satisfying than jealousy. The specific deflation of a person who has been carrying a convenient story about someone for 7 years and has just watched that story become impossible to maintain. It was at that moment that Mia appeared at his shoulder. She had seen me from across the room and had come over, and I could tell from the careful neutrality of her expression that she had been composing her face for the 30 seconds it took her to cross the ballroom. She said, "Naomi." "Oh my gosh. Hi." I said, "Mia. You look well." She did. She looked well. She looked like a woman who had gotten what she wanted and was living with the moderate texture of it. Not unhappy, not radiant, but settled in the particular way of someone who had stopped expecting to be surprised by their own life. She said, "It's so good to see you. I've thought about you so many times over the years." He nodded. I did not say "I've thought about you too," because it would not have been true in the way she meant it. What I said was, "I hope you're well, both of you." And I meant it. Not warmly, not coldly. I meant it the way you mean it about people who exist entirely outside the perimeter of your life, with genuine, distant indifference. Then I turned back to Priya and said, "You were telling me about the new ER protocol. I want to hear the rest of that." And I did not look back at Daniel and Mia again for the remainder of the evening. Later, near the end of the night, when the bar had thinned and the overhead lights had come up slightly and people were finding their coats, I overheard Daniel talking to someone near the exit. I wasn't trying to listen. I was standing maybe 8 feet away, waiting for my car service to confirm the pickup. He said, Naomi Reeves. She built a whole company in New York. Over $1 million a year. The person he was talking to said something I couldn't hear. Daniel said, No, I knew her. We were, yeah. A long time ago. We were. Past tense. Filed correctly, finally. A long time ago my car confirmation arrived. I picked up my coat. I walked through the lobby of that hotel and out into the Chicago night air. That specific October cold that is different from every other city's cold. That sharp lake wind that has been the backdrop of more significant moments in my life than any other weather on earth. And I exhaled. Not in relief exactly. In completion. I had walked into that room with nothing to prove and everything already proven. I had not raised my voice. I had not rehearsed a speech. I had not needed to. The work I had done in 7 years had walked into that ballroom before I did and simply waited for the right moment to be visible. The champagne glass line, the one that got shared on social media by someone who had been standing nearby and apparently found it quotable, happened a little earlier in the evening before the conversation with Daniel, when someone at the bar had asked a general question to the group about regrets. I had said quietly, raising my glass toward no one in particular, You were the best thing that never happened to me. It wasn't directed at Daniel specifically. It wasn't a performance. It was just the truest sentence I knew how to say about the previous 7 years of my life, offered to a room full of people at a reunion in the city where my life had once come apart and been rebuilt into something I was genuinely proud of. Mia had been standing close enough to hear it. She had looked at the floor. Daniel had had nothing left to say. And I had walked away, glass in hand, coat on my arm, car waiting outside. Exactly the way they had walked away from me 7 years ago in that flickering hallway. Except this time I was the one who didn't look back. I am 33 years old. I own an apartment in Manhattan. I run a company that I built from a registered LLC and $14,200 in savings and the very specific motivation of a woman who was told, implicitly and explicitly, that she was not enough. I do not hate Daniel. I do not hate Mia. I want to say that clearly because I think there is a version of this story where the teller nurses the wound for the audience's entertainment, and that is not the story I am telling. I genuinely, fully do not think about them in any way that costs me energy. What I think about is the girl on the kitchen floor. The one who peeled 14 save-the-date magnets off a refrigerator at 6 in the morning and put them in a drawer because she wasn't ready to make it permanent. The one who submitted a graduate school application on grief and stubbornness and absolutely nothing else. I think about her because she is the one who did the work. Not me, not the version of me who walked into that ballroom. Or, if you are her right now, if you are in the apartment, in the silence, in the season before the rebuild, I need you to hear this. The people who underestimate you are not seeing clearly. They never were. And the life you build in the years after the worst thing will be the most honest answer you will ever give them. You do not have to say a word. Just build that. If this story resonated with you, if you recognize something in the kitchen floor moment, or in the years of quiet rebuilding that nobody saw, or in that specific experience of being dismissed by someone who was supposed to know you best, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Tell me what chapter of your own rebuild you're in right now. Because this community is full of people who are further along than they realize, and sometimes the most useful thing is just knowing that someone else started from the floor too. If this story meant something to you, share it with one person who needs it today. And if you're new here, welcome. Subscribe because there are more stories coming. And every single one of them ends with someone choosing themselves. I'll see you in the next one.